country, acknowledgement to country, and pay respects to our elders, past, present and emerging, of our traditional custodians of all the lands we're meeting on this evening, and always with a heart full of absolute gratitude for their amazing stewardship of all these lands for millennia. So thanks everybody. Sandra, if you're able to mute, that would be awesome. Sandy, sorry, welcome. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome tonight Wendy Gleen as our guest speaker. And I hope some of you have already read her a bit of a spiel that she wrote, but I'll just read it out in case you haven't, because she's so accomplished and it's going to be a fabulous presentation. So Wendy grew up in the bushland paradise of the Northern Beaches of New South Wales and witnessed the gradual disappearance of local wildlife, from koalas and gliders to wrens and skinks. Wild species quietly vanished to be replaced by houses, and no one else seemed to notice. This sparked Wendy's lifelong quest to shine the spotlight on New South Wales' most underrated biodiversity. From senior keeper of native fauna at Taronga Zoo to her current role as support officer for Lake Macquarie City Council Landcare, Wendy loves to find and tell stories from the local wildscape. From tales of grand ecosystem processes to the tiny vital lives of our smallest species. She has a master's in ecology and lives in the middle of the Watagan Mountains, where she spends as much time as possible observing the local flora and fauna. Like permaculture, Landcare is both a movement and a practice, and has a common goal: the preservation of a healthy, self-sustaining planet. Wendy is going to be talking about Landcare with biodiversity as her main theme, but she'll also talk about how to maximise biodiversity values of your own permaculture garden, and hopes to deepen the perspective of its importance in the wider landscape. So very excited to welcome Wendy, and I'll just preface with saying she'd really love probably to leave questions to the end. So as you think of them, pop them in the chat pod, but just depending how she's going with her groove, we'll either take them in mid presentation if she's feeling like that's where she wants to go, or otherwise we might leave them to the end. So a big welcome to you, Wendy, and I'll invite you to share the screen now.
Great, thank you so much, Kerry. Oh, that should be it. Excellent. That's sharing okay?
Beautiful. Perfect.
Okay, terrific. Okay, well, thanks, Kerry, for that intro. Hope I can live up to that one. Yes, as Kerry said, I'm going to be talking about biodiversity, which is obviously a topic with an absolutely massive scope. And it's always hard to pitch it because I know I'm preaching a little bit to the converted. So, and you guys are all, I'm sure, very well informed. So forgive me if I go back to the basics a bit, but I always find it's a really great just reminder. I've quite enjoyed putting it together myself because it's really helped me kind of get, tie everything together a bit, things that I've been thinking about for a while. So I'll just skip to... Oh, why isn't that? Sorry, my presentation is not responding. Why that would be? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So yes, as Kerry said in the introduction, I'll quickly run through a little bit about my quest, which is the reason I'm so passionate about the topic of biodiversity. Then we'll look quickly at the threats to local natural areas. Again, I'm sure you're aware of all of those. Some of them are really obvious and explicit, and some of them are a little more hidden or insidious. So we'll go through a few of those. Look at what Landcare is, which is, as I said, where I'm working at the moment, and what our main goals are, which hinges closely on biodiversity. So we'll delve into getting to grips with exactly what biodiversity is and ecosystem function, which those two things are almost synonymous. Then finally, look at how permaculture mitigates some of these threats to local biodiversity And then the three of the things that you can do to maximise your garden's biodiversity values. So just to start with, I did grow up, I had a very blessed childhood growing up in the Northern Beaches in New South Wales, where we were about, I think, the third house built in our area, which is Clareville, up above Pittwater. And there was the most extraordinary biodiversity as a little girl that we had in our local surroundings. There were koalas and quolls and squirrel gliders. We had the most extraordinary diversity of small birds, and the morning chorus, I think we took that for granted. The morning chorus was, I still can vaguely remember it, it was just absolutely beautiful. And then unfortunately, as the houses popped up around us, one by one species started to disappear, and nobody really seemed to notice. That's the problem with a lot of these conservation issues, of course, is they're such a slow process. It's sort of death by 1,000 cuts, and it happens so slowly that you don't really notice it until it's too late. So there still are some hardy native species hanging on, like the possums and the kookaburras and the noisy miners. But even those guys these days, I've noticed, so my parents still live in Avalon, I still spend a bit of time there. And these days there's a bit of a monoculture, unfortunately, around that area. So quite a simplified ecosystem, comprised of just a fewer species. Probably the biomass is similar, but it's comprised of less species, and the whole system's a lot simpler. So this homogenization of wildlife, of nature, is a huge issue globally as well as locally. So yeah, a lot of conservation is about these little things and noticing these changes. Now, as urban development, of course, is spreading up and down the coast these days out of Sydney, especially with everyone fleeing from those built up areas at the moment, it is this great chance to be able to learn from those mistakes and notice those processes and work to turn the tide. And that's why permaculture is such a heartening, wonderful movement, because I love those principles of living with nature. So I think there's so much power in that movement, and I do hope it continues to grow rapidly. So quickly moving on to the slightly more depressing topic, which we'll get through out the way quickly. So these are some of the threats, of course, that you're all aware of that are impacting remnant bushland patches. Some of them are, as I said, fairly self-explanatory. Invasive species, changed fire regimes. Of course, our native plants are quite well adapted to a particular fire regime, and if that changes, becomes more intense or less frequent, then that is going to impact the vegetation community, most definitely. Then there are the more subtle things. I was chatting earlier, and I believe you guys do consider edge effects in your planning. But just to recap, I actually did my thesis partly on this. So an ecological edge is where there are two different types of ecosystem. That could be anything at all, a grassland, for example, and a wet sclerophyll forest that are next to each other. And at that edge where those two ecosystems meet, there are conditions which are different to the core of those ecosystems respectively. So what's on the edge is different to what's in the core of the forest or the grassland. And so when you're looking at the urban edge, of course, those impacts are quite significant. Where the urban edge butts up against bushland, for example, you can usually have an increased humidity, greater wind often, it's lighter usually, and they're all the abiotic effects. And then the biotic effects are things like a changed predation risk. So, for example, if you're a small mammal, the urban edge is a fairly risky place to live because the predators can easily patrol that edge and just pick you off. So it's a risky place to live, which then impacts populations there. And those edge effects can actually impact the bushland several hundred metres inwards. And then the flow-on effects from that, from those changed populations at the edge, those flow-on effects can then impact right into the, if it's a smallish patch, right into the core of that bushland patch. So see, these are some of the threats that are out there happening, but they're not necessarily immediately obvious. The other issue is the urbanisation of the surrounding landscape. So what in ecology we call, where you've got that mix of urbanisation and bushland remnant patches, we call that the urban matrix. And the more intensely developed that urban matrix is, the greater are those pressures on those little remnant patches. Okay, so like permaculture, Landcare is a principle as well as an organisation, and we're a three-tiered structure. We have a national, state and local level, but we're fundamentally grassroots. So we run on and sometimes by volunteers who are concerned about the state of the local environment. And primarily we work at regenerating degraded natural areas. So some of the things we can do include weeding. That's probably our most common purpose, is weeding particularly infested areas. We plant where it's appropriate, but the best approach is to allow a patch to regenerate itself naturally, so that you're fostering or you're maximising the genetic diversity of that patch, which I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And again, with regards to habitat features, where possible, the best thing to do is to actually encourage and retain the existing habitat features. For example, a big old tree that might have been growing there for maybe 100 or 150 years provides just this extraordinary resource in so many ways. It provides the hollows and the bark that invertebrates can live in, all those sorts of things. And you can use books, but that doesn't quite cover those that real almost mini ecosystem. It's like you can retain the habitat features. It's best to, but you can augment. And many other tasks as well, not least is community engagement, which again, we have a strong overlap, I think, in potential with permaculture, in having that real connection with the local community and being able to engage people in those sorts of processes. And I'll just pause quickly here and ask, what is a weed? Because sometimes we grow weeds in our garden, and sometimes the weeds in our garden and the weeds in the bush we might consider quite differently. So I will describe or define a weed as an invader of a natural system that disrupts its function. So like that picture in the corner there of the Madeira vine, you can see there that completely swamps and outcompetes that patch there, and really nothing else can live there. So that it's pretty much completely disrupting that system. So one role or one great thing you can do as permaculturists is to be aware of the weed effect, and just be aware of that potential of what you're planting, and keep them contained where possible. And again, have that conversation with others about some of the issues that weeds can cause if they do get out and about the bush. So I will show you some before and after photos of a successful Landcare project. So you can see up the top there was a terribly weedy patch with there was Madeira, several different sort of strata of weeds getting right up into the canopy there. And that was weeded and planted, and then down the bottom there you can see the regrowth, and you can see the difference in complexity there. And as that continues to establish, you will see a much greater diversity of species, but also of vegetation structure, which is really important. So you'll have all of those vegetation strata levels covered, instead of just, as you can see at the top there, really just the ground cover, and then a very, very dense, impenetrable wall of weed mat. So that's not particularly useful to wildlife, and of course reduces your biodiversity. So essentially, Landcare goals are to, at the end of the day, preserve biodiversity. And then this then supports the continuation of ecosystem function and almost by definition, ecosystem complexity. And the reason this is also important is because it's these processes that dictate the ability of a species or a system to be able to adapt and evolve. And of course, with the incredible changes that the world's facing at the moment, that is absolutely essential. So biodiversity is the diversity of life on Earth, and it can be measured at any scale, but usually and most typically we measure it at the scale of landscape or species or genetic. So I'll start with landscape diversity. So you can see there some of the biogeographic regions that have been defined by the Australian government. And so these this complex system of landscapes creates a wonderful strength to the landscape. So just a bit, I guess, a bit like a human community. The more diverse your community is, the stronger and the more resilient that it is. And it's the same. It's the same with landscapes, and the same as a principle with biodiversity. And you can break that large-scale national map down, of course, further and further and further. So, for an example, I've shown a patch from the seed maps of near Tuggerah Lake on the Central Coast, and you can see that those landscape patterns can be, you can look at that at a finer scale, and you can keep going until, of course, you're at your own garden level. And you may have, for example, a creek running through your garden or your property with some riparian vegetation, and then next to that you may have some sclerophyll forest. So you've got those two landscapes, even at a very, very small scale in your neighbourhood. And I know you guys all those sorts of things as well when you're designing a garden, that you consider the small scale geology and also microclimate of that space. So as I've moved from working with small mammals to pretty much the complete other end of the scale, working with huge whole ecosystems, I've been having fun with a bit of an analogy, which is probably a bit of an occupational hazard from being a zookeeper, because I've been thinking of them almost as creatures in their own right. And so playing with an analogy, you could call the species that comprise those ecosystems, you could think of those as being the vital organs that keep them healthy, and then the landscape as a community of different ecosystems which are all working together. And this is a sand dune that I was working on. I met the Landcare there, which it was in Lake Macquarie, and the Landcare has been working there for many, many years, I think decades. So he knew this system really, really well, and he'd watched as a drainage system slightly south of this dune system had been altered, and it changed the pattern of water, and it also changed where the nutrition was, or basically where the organic matter was being deposited, which then of course changed where the vegetation was growing, which then started to impact the whole movement of that little dune system. And it actually started, as they do, to pick up and move. And you can see it there just starting to encroach. I was standing on the car park, and you can give a little sinister shiver at the thought of it sort of predating, moving forwards to slowly predate the car park. It's really, really quite amazing to see the power of these things. So these days, of course, we understand a lot more about how these systems work, and that some of the small changes that you can make can have these rather huge unforeseen consequences. So that is my ecosystem monster. Okay, so that we've considered the landscape scale of biodiversity, and we're moving on now to species diversity. So when you think of biodiversity or when you think of conservation, it's where, as humans, we tend to sort of default to is species diversity. And many of our conservation campaigns use a flagship species to illustrate their issue. And it's usually a species that's a fairly obvious species that's usually diurnal and usually large. So koala is a great example. Save the koala, or perhaps save the tiger, all of which, of course, are highly threatened and definitely need help. But it is important to remember that these issues are always so much bigger than one species. So they're, as I said, they're great as flagship species to raise awareness, but the issues are usually pretty complex, and it's good to remember that. And the other problem with a species-based approach to conservation, of course, is you're kind of forced into playing God, and you tend to focus more on those iconic, charismatic species, and you might lose out or the smaller species might lose out, or the smaller taxa. For example, we're all aware of how incredibly important fungi is. And without fungi, pretty much the natural world would cease to exist. It would probably collapse in a little dry, dusty heap. The fungi kingdom, as you're probably all aware, is I think it's actually larger than the plant kingdom, or it's getting up there anyway. It's huge. It's an extraordinary component of biodiversity. So sometimes to be a bit naughty at the zoo, I would be the advocate and suggest that if we're going to concentrate on saving a species, we should perhaps look at fungi instead of koalas. But that of course is very much tongue-in-cheek, and of course the koalas definitely need all the help that they can get. But it does all relate to my absolute love affair with the Potoroo, who are mycophagous or fungi specialists. And this is Dottie. He's an absolute sweetheart, having a little scratch there. And in all my years at the zoo, obviously met thousands and thousands of zoo visitors. And usually people come to the zoo for a variety of reasons, but it's usually perhaps to see the chimpanzees. It might be for the kids to play in the playground, or it might be if you're overseas, to see a koala or perhaps a zebra. As far as I'm aware, nobody has ever gone to the zoo to see a Potoroo. And I can understand why, because they are quite small and quite cryptic, and they live right in the middle of the bush, or in our case, right in the middle of the dark nocturnal house. So I get that they're not front and center when you think of coming to the zoo, but they are just extraordinary little creatures. And apart from anything else, they have an amazing personality and character. They're absolutely wonderful little creatures. They're kind of the clown of the animal world. And I'll introduce you to Eddie in a minute. But of course, as I said, and I should just mention as well, you guys probably know what a Potoroo is, but just in case you've not met one before, they are tiny kangaroos. And the clue is in their back feet. So their back feet look exactly the same as a large, say, red kangaroo. They're exactly the same, but absolutely tiny. So as I said, they're a tiny kangaroo. We're going okay for time. I think I will quickly tell a little anecdote because it was absolutely charming. We had some visitors from, I think they were from America, and they came to the zoo, and I was giving them a behind the scenes tour. And I asked which animal they were particularly keen on seeing, which native animal they wanted to see. And the gentleman said he wanted to see a tiny kangaroo. And I was absolutely thrilled because I thought, oh, maybe all of the talks about Potoroos, they've been in the limelight a bit recently. Maybe words got out, and this all the way to the US, people are hearing about how amazing these tiny kangaroo Potoroos are. So I said, oh, great, where did you hear about our tiny little kangaroos? And he said, oh, it's from the song. I said, what song? He goes, Tiny Kangaroo Down Sport. So So sorry, that was a bit corny, but absolutely true. And I thought it was rather charming. So the Potoroos, apart from being tiny kangaroos and feeding on fungi, are a wonderful example, particularly when you're talking to kids, of explaining about ecosystem function. So the Potoroos feed on the fruiting bodies of truffles, which you can see. I forgot to put the photo credit there. That was Pam O'Sullivan, who's a fungi expert. She foraged those up for me. That's the Potoroo's favourite food. They'll sniff out those truffles, gobble them up, and then hop around the forest and spread the spores in their droppings. And then there's another step, a little dung beetle comes along, picks up the Potoroo dropping and rolls it underground. And of course, the fungi forms mycorrhizal tendrils that stabilise the soil. I'm sure you guys are all aware of this. They stabilise the soil and they attach themselves to the roots of plants so that the plants can take up extra nutrients and moisture from the soil. Particularly important in Australia because our soils are so poor. The theory is that there's been, because we're geologically quiet and have been for eons, there's not been that turnover of the soil, so a lot of the nutrients have leached out. So it's a pretty harsh environment, and particularly with regards to soil nutrition. So having these fungi and the Potoroos to spread the spores and the dung beetles to jump in on the system, and everything needs each other, the plants, and everything's part of that web of life. And so they're just an absolutely wonderful example of, as I said, ecosystem function. Potoroos were the first animal described by Governor Phillip in Botany Bay. So they would have been all, pretty common up and down the eastern coast. Of course, they're now unfortunately locally extinct around Sydney. But I'm not sure if you're aware, there is a tiny population of them in Gosford, in Kincumber Mountain, that was discovered fairly recently, which is just extraordinary that these little animals are still hanging on right on the edge of a city. Right. Okay, phew. So sorry, I'm obviously becoming a bit of a Potoroo talk, but I'll just quickly introduce you to Eddie because he was such an extraordinary little creature. He was basically the animal love of my life. As you can see, he kept some fairly exalted company. He did meet David Attenborough, and that's my finger there on the left. He was a product of menopause, which is when kangaroos can become pregnant and actually suspend their pregnancy. It goes into sort of a suspended animation. And they can hang on to that pregnancy for quite some months. And his mum was part of a female group on display at the zoo. And unfortunately, she passed away through age-related complications. And as I said, she'd been part of this female group for quite some time. So finding a little Joey in her pouch was an absolute surprise. And my colleague actually started hand raising him, but I luckily managed to take over fairly early on. I completely fell for him. The first time I saw him, my colleague Annette was giving him a warm bath. He'd somehow contracted ringworm. And I opened the door to the kitchen and saw him reclining in this little shallow bath. He would have been about that long, about 10, 15 centimetres long. And I swear he had his little elbows hooked over the edge of the bath. And I remember him almost sort of floating in the water with his legs stretched out, having a little tummy rub in this warm bath of diluted iodine. And he was just an absolute charmer. And he used to come with me pretty much everywhere to meetings, and you could always tell where he was because you could hear people laughing. So just an absolutely magic little animal. And one thing he taught me was that intelligence, although it's such a hard thing to measure, it's all about cracking the language barrier. And there's all these little tiny creatures living out there in our forests, and they've all got this incredible personality and character to them. so I guess it's another dimension to losing these species. It's sort of a tragedy in lots of ways, but yeah, that's just another dimension to it, or this personality that we're missing out on. Right, so dragging myself away from Potoroos. So we have. Should I take a pause? Are there any questions, Carrie, or shall I keep rolling on?
While we're on Potoroos, a Potoroo question which you have partially answered. Which Sandy had said, whereabouts do we find Potoroos now? And what sort of fungi do they eat, which you did answer truffles. So I'm curious, is that the truffles that we spend so much money on at expensive delis?
Good question. No. Well, yes and no. So they are the same sort of group of organisms, but that we don't know much about. I'm a little bit out of touch with this, so I haven't looked at it for a while, but we don't know much about the Australian native truffles. And again, there's this tremendous diversity of different species of native truffles. And we just I don't think we've identified even the bulk of them. There's still new discoveries quite regularly of new species of these mycorrhizal fungi. So there's still a lot to learn there, but there are lots of different species. I did test one. I found a truffle once and I offered it to Eddie to see what would happen, and not wanting him to actually eat it because I didn't actually know what it was, whether it was toxic or not, but he actually snatched it from me. I had no choice. He snatched it from me, shoved it in his mouth, and it was gone in about less than a second. So, and he was totally fine. So they obviously know that they definitely know whether it's toxic or not.
Yeah. Fantastic. It was just wonderful to hear about that interrelationship with mycorrhizal fungi. And I know, anybody who's been around Permaculture Central Coast for a while has probably heard of that. As far as, as permaculturists, when we're digging gardens, we try and actually avoid digging as much as possible. We'd rather build soil. Obviously, when you build it, putting in advanced trees like nut trees and fruit trees, there's not much avoiding it there. But typically speaking, a lot of us do prefer just to build soil in situ rather than dig, create no-dig gardens and so forth, because not wanting to interfere with that beautiful mycorrhizal network and, the wonderful job it does bringing nutrients to all the plants and helping create that beautiful biodiversity in our soils. So,
absolutely.
So there's a big awareness of that. But just back to the Potoroos for a minute before we move on. So what sort of numbers of Potoroos are they thinking are at Kincumber Mountain? And is Kincumber Mountain one of the only places they are still existing?
Locally, yes, that would be. And again, I'm not a researcher, but this is just from my general knowledge, that population would be small and would be under fairly significant threat, I'd say, in terms of sustainability. Again, because of that connectivity, that's a fairly sort of becoming quite an isolated patch. So yeah, it's a very important little reservoir there.
Great. And where else do you find them in Australia then?
If you get out of the built-up areas, so down towards Jervis Bay, Barren Grounds, I believe. I've not been there, but Barren Grounds I know is a good spot to see them. There is one or two records from around the Watagans, and then again you'd need to get find the sort of the coastal side of the Great Eastern Ranges, but outside of the built-up areas. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you.
Oh, I should just.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to quickly say, of course, bandicoots and also the local bush rats that I'm about to talk about also will feed on the fungi and have part of that same cycle. So yeah, and
well, there we go.
You'll find in local gardens. I meant to say that. So
yes, I think quite a few of us here can relate to having bandicoots in our garden, especially active at the moment.
Yes, and they also will eat funnel web spiders. So there you go.
Oh wow,
they're paying for their keep.
No wonder they like my place. It sounds like Sandy's converted. She's a big fan of the Potoroo now. So you're all good. Maybe she'll go to the zoo just to see the Potoroo.
Okay. All right. Well, I better crack on. I've just realised the time's ticking away. So this is a bit of a passionate one of mine, the genetic diversity side of biodiversity, because it seems to have dropped out of the conversation a bit more recently. So I'll illustrate the concept again, talking about when I was doing my master's project. I had sites up and down the Central Coast and Northern Sydney, and my target species was the bush rat. So native bush rats, very, very different ecologically to the feral black rat, but they look quite similar. So bush rats are good. They spread fungi, seeds, and they're not very good climbers, or they're not keen climbers, so they don't predate birds' nests. Black rats, as we know, breed up into huge numbers, will predate birds' nests, and are ecologically not a great thing. But because they look quite similar, you need to get your eye in when you're doing some ecological research. And generally speaking, it was a fairly easy job. The black rat, as you can see up the top left there, their ears are bigger. If you imagine folding that ear down, it would cover the eye, whereas in the bush rat, the ears are a little smaller. The black rat's tail is much longer. It's longer than their head and body length. Just for you at home, if you're wondering if you've got a bush or a black rat in your garden, if it's climbing, and if it's climbing up, for example, onto your deck, into the roof, and it's got a long tail, that will be a black rat. The bush rats tend to stick to the bush. You can see with the bush rat, they kind of carry their tail a bit differently too, and it looks like somebody's just come along and got their tail and just pushed it into their bum. It looks like it's sort of separate, whereas the black rat's tail kind of tapers. So there's these different physiological differences. You can tell them apart. But then I got to, again, Kingcumber's a special place. I got to the Kingcumber side, and there were these indeterminate rats. I could not work out what they were. They seem to be, as I said, indeterminate between the features of the bush rat and the black rat. And in case you're wondering, the two can't interbreed. They are definitely different species. So I took wide advice, and we eventually concurred that they were very definitely bush rats, but they did look very, as you can see, really quite different. And so this is a great illustration of genetic diversity. So bush rats are found over they're still relatively common, and they're found over a fairly wide geographic area and a fairly connected sort of spread. And there's obviously a lot of genetic diversity within that species, because they look quite different. I was really interested in how different they look from site to site. So that genetic diversity is so important, and it's why it is so important to not just conserve a species full stop, but to conserve that species across its range. And this is a concept that is particularly pertinent when it comes to the more common species. When we think about conservation, we tend to not worry too much about the common species, think that, well, they're okay. But in actual fact, that they're not. If they're losing this genetic diversity, they're going to be in a bit of trouble. So I'm going to, again, illustrate this with an hypothetical play with this hypothetical suggestion. So let's just say that, and this is not based on anything, but let's just say that the Kingcumber bush rat, you can see their ears are a little bit bigger. Let's just say that they therefore can cope better in hot weather, because they get heat more from the veins in those ears. So they might cope better with a warming climate. Whereas the others might struggle a bit. So as climate change were to intensify, you might find that we start to lose bush rats, but the Kingcumber bush rats with those larger ears actually do better, and they start to breed up, and they then spread out from that little area, spread out and start to take over other patches. And in the end, you might find that whereas the bush rat might have become extinct, thanks to the Kingcumber rats with their larger ears, they prevail. Those bush rats had the edge, and they were able to survive those changes. That's an example of how basically the fact that genetic diversity confers the ability of a species to be able to adapt and change. And this is another example, again, at a more landscape level. You may have in your area a spotted gum forest, which might not be a critically endangered habitat necessarily, but you can see the difference there. They're all spotted gum forests, but they're all unique. They're all slightly differently. And that's, again, a reflection of genetic diversity. So wherever you live in the world, I like to say your patch, your little neighborhood is absolutely unique. The history and the microclimate there and the geology, all of those factors, basically give your local area a sort of a fingerprint, which makes it absolutely unique and irreplaceable. Okay, so they're all the levels of biodiversity, and a consequence of preserving biodiversity is that you end up with a complex ecosystem. And these are the little feathertail gliders that I call the hidden consequences of habitat loss. So these animals, you can see how tiny they are. That's Mr. Whiskers there on somebody's hand. And they have this constant vibration. So when you hold them, they're just constantly vibrating. They're absolutely magic. And if you put Mr. Whiskers in someone's hand, you've got this incredible emotional connection, this sort of emotional shock that people undergo, and you can get in there then and explain about some of these concepts. So Mr. Whiskers, he's good at working the room. And because they're so tiny and their metabolism kicks over so fast, as you can imagine, they can't go without food for very long. So wherever they live, it needs to supply a good range of hiding places, patches of vegetation density so they can escape predators. And there always needs to be some kind of food on the go. So something needs to be flowering or producing sap or producing fostering insect populations. And there needs to be that connectivity so that they can move around and chase food resources. So if you put all that together, that is the description of a very complex forest habitat. So when you hear of people saying, oh, I'm just going to clear, or just, I've got a property, it's just covered in scrub, I'm just going to clear this patch of scrub, my heart always drops, because you think, gosh, who knows what's living there and who knows how incredibly important that little patch might be. So wonderful permaculture gardens. Some of the wonderful ways they support biodiversity is buffering edge effects to bushland, and I love that the photo. I just got that off the internet, but you can see there the garden just sort of melding into the background bush there, and really just mitigating those edge effects that can be so critical. Of course, providing habitat for local fauna, including invertebrates, and maintaining those all important natural functions and keeping things cycling, and as well, of course, a biodiversity reservoir. So I know you guys, actually I might move on to the next slide because that illustrates it particularly well. Moving on to the three things. Of course, there are lots of ways the permaculture gardens can assist biodiversity, but I've picked three that are, I think, quite important. I'll start with connectivity, because wherever you are, your garden is incredibly important as a connector in the landscape. And I think fragmentation is one of the greatest problems facing our local bushland. So if you think of your garden as a really important stepping stone in the landscape, but also connectivity within your garden as well. And perhaps if you think about what fauna you have locally, and specifically how you can assist that fauna with maybe vegetation structure or plant species diversity. An example here is, again, cucumber. You can see there that there's, can I remove that? between Kincumber there and Budai National Park, which is sort of slightly further north, just around where the scenic road goes, there's a bit of a gap there in the vegetation. And there are populations of yellow-bellied gliders in that area. And there, until recently, was a population at Kincumber and around that bushland area. And if we could connect that population up with Budai National Park, that will be a tremendous step towards ensuring their survival into the future, because that's so important for them to be able to move around and find new resources and breed with each other and all of those sorts of things. So you could see if everybody in that little gap there had a permaculture garden, that would connect up those areas, and that would pretty much save, I think, the yellow-bellied gliders locally. So that's just an example of the power of doing the right thing. Of course, structure and habitat features is another thing, and particularly a messy garden tends to be a very a biodiverse garden, and also a messy garden is most helpful to wildlife, particularly if you've got some dense patches, again, to give refuge to the smaller creatures and the birds. And consider that if you've got any old trees in your neighbourhood, that a tree needs to be over 120 years old before it will provide a hollow large enough for a yellow-bellied glider. So if you lose one of those big old trees, even if we planted a replacement today, it's not going to be ready in our lifetime for an animal like a yellow-bellied glider. So that's something to bear in mind when you go into bat for your local trees, or even preserving a dead tree, as I said, is really important as well. And then biodiversity itself, by retaining locally native plants, or if you can plant a little patch, incorporate that into your garden. That's a tremendously important thing to do as well, because of course then you're fostering as well the local fungi, the local invertebrate populations, and so forth. It's really the building block to biodiversity, those locally native plant species, if you can factor those in. So I think snuck in on time. That's about it. Does anyone have any questions?
We might just take a second to look at that beautiful slide, I think, if that's okay, before we take questions. Wow.
It's lovely, isn't it?
It's gorgeous.
Yes, it's wonderful. The tremendous sort of overlap and scope for collaboration between permaculture and Landcare. I think there's lots to explore. It certainly got me enthusiastic about doing a bit more in that area.
Yeah, definitely. And one of our members, Susie German, is a permaculturist, a horticulturist, and a very long-standing Landcare volunteer, and also being paid by local council for some time to work in that area. So it's been really wonderful for her to come to the permaculture world, and for us to gain from her knowledge too, because at first she wasn't sure of what all this permaculture stuff was all about, but she's really come to appreciate the overlap and the linkages that there are. So yeah, she's unfortunately not online tonight. She's studying again, so life is pretty busy. Some sort of botany or something she's doing at the moment. But she's been a great asset to this group, to really create that knowledge. Sandy was just asking, she's our main questioner tonight. I don't know where everybody else's questions are, but please speak up if there's something you'd like to ask. Sandy's saying, how can we find out which are the local species to plant? And I would like to create a native verge garden, but not sure what to put in there. That would help build a corridor and provide safe haven for native wildlife.
Oh, how lovely. Well, it would probably best to speak to your local council.
Yeah. Somebody's just put in there, I'm sure you're aware of the CEN.
Yes.
So it's been selling plants online from their local nursery as well. So, and it's also, they're great value because they often have tube stock.
Yeah.
And it is really great service. So I think somebody posted recently about CEN nursery online. So
yeah,
great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Garden center's name, I think.
Is somebody asking a question, or maybe needs to mute? Okay, Yuki. Roberta said a fantastic talk. So
oh, bless.
She's not biased at all. Roberta we were talking about today.
Yeah, no bias there.
That we both
bless
know.
her heart.
Fantastic. What other sort of native species do you think that what we might actually be potentially having living on our properties or adjacent to our properties that we need to be aware of in this area, Wendy?
Oh gosh, good question. Well, bandicoots, of course, are important, and you could potentially have brown bandicoots as well as the long-nosed bandicoots. And little pygmy possums or feather-tailed gliders could potentially be around, and because they're so tiny, of course, you just hardly ever see them. There's a great nest box project going on at around the Pittwater offshore communities, and they've made you can look it up, just Pittwater. Or if you Googled like Lovett Bay, feather-tailed glider, pygmy possum, something like that, it would come up, and they'll give you the dimensions of the nest boxes that they're making, which are basically just sort of hollow logs that they've capped. And they've been really successful. And they've got cameras up as well, and they've had feather-tailed gliders and pygmy possums move in actually in people's backyards. So that's been really cool.
Yeah.
Was potentially the odd quoll might still be hanging in. There was one sighted the other day up at Lake Macquarie.
Right.
So yeah, it's never ceases to amaze me where wildlife pops up. So you never know. And of course the native rodents, the swamp rats and the bush rats, those guys hopefully are still around as well, particularly where there's that habitat connectivity and not too many black rats. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the bush rats can actually outcompete the black rats if they've actually got initial residency. So yeah, that's a pretty
fantastic. Well, yeah, I think there's a little bit of a drop in internet connectivity there. So I'll just go back to Clara's question. Well, I know she loves her little bit of bush next door to her place or on her property. What are your thoughts on people caring for native pets and birds?
Good question. You mean caring for them as in having them as pets?
Is that what you meant, Clara? Do you want to go on mic?
Sorry, my mic was off. Yeah, there are people who I've noticed keeping native snakes and native birds as pets are probably the only ones I've seen. Just wondering what your thoughts on that. Is that increasing diversity in terms of the genetics, or is that doing a disservice to them? A native bird than an exotic parrot, or what do you sort of think about that?
Okay, so this is just my personal opinion, of course. It's sort of a separate issue, what it is and it isn't. And I'll talk about mammals because I know there are occasionally pushes for the regulations to be relaxed to allow for keeping of native mammals as pets. At the moment, there are two species that you can legally keep, which is the plains rat and the spinifex hopping mice. But I'm generally speaking, I'm actually against it personally, just because if we can't seem to even keep our domestic animals well, cats and dogs, people can't even keep those properly from time to time. So I think until we can get our pet ownership consolidated and everyone doing the right thing, then there's all sorts of added problems and complications with keeping native wildlife, and I don't feel confident that speaking at a population level, of course, not I mean, I'm sure there are individuals that would do a wonderful job, but at a population level, I don't think we've got the ability to be able to keep them well. And the other issue is that if you were keeping them as pets, then that captive population would have the genetics would not be part of the wild population. There'd be like a subset, and then if you did get escapes, then they would be actually decreasing. Technically, they'd be decreasing the genetic diversity of the wild populations if they did get out and breed with those wild populations. The other problem with it is that it seems to be human nature to want to breed different colours and different phenotypes. So that's a problem as well. And again, that kind of messes with the genetics of the wild species. And if those genes then get out into the wild population, again, you're just decreasing and upsetting your genetic diversity there in the population.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about mammals because that's, like you said, mostly illegal. But I was sort of thinking, I guess from my point of view, I keep quail, and I chose to go with the quail that was native to Australia. But I wonder, is there more of a chance of doing damage with a native quail? Or, I mean, I keep my hands very well.
Yeah. I think that's at the end of the day, it comes down to if you're a good and responsible pet owner, then that's absolutely wonderful. So you're doing all the right things. Yep. And I don't think. I don't know if there'd be. I can't think off the top of my head of advantages or disadvantages in that. If you're keeping an animal really well, whether it's native or not. Other than actually, I guess there is a really good point, because you've got a terrific avenue for sort of community engagement, and you can learn about those quails, and it's sort of in situ. It's a much more immediate to sort of the wild situation that you can discuss. So yeah, there is that benefit.
Yeah, the big advantage is that they're adapted to the climate.
Yep. So animal welfare, absolutely, as well. Yeah, good point. Yeah. You're muted, Kerry. Sorry.
That old trick.
That old chestnut.
Just the question that we, I anticipated coming up this morning. Yuki's asked about feeding bread to wild birds, and I know I spoke with you about the post that Meg just did about feeding magpies meat, and in general feeding wildlife. So yeah, could you speak to that a little bit, please?
Sure. So I think the best thing, again, that you can do for wildlife and birds is provide habitat and provide natural avenues for food resources. So basically planting local feed trees, and supporting your local biodiversity, which then supports then you can have a diverse wild population that is self-sustaining. However, having said that, you can get so much pleasure and joy from that close interaction with birds. So like a bird bath, absolutely, you can't go wrong with a bird bath. And even to an extent feeding birds, but just as long as you really think about what you're doing and think about the potential consequences of what you're doing. So if you're just feeding a small amount of nutritional food that's appropriate for the species that you're feeding, and you're not feeding it too much, and you're feeding it irregularly so that it's not dependent on you, and if you get so much joy from that interaction, then I'd say, yeah, that's just everything in moderation, and that's fine. But if you're feeding something that's not nutritionally balanced, like bread, that can spread all sorts of fungi issues, because it sort of gets a bit wet and it gets stuck all around their beak, and then you can get fungal or bacterial infections. And also that congregation of birds can spread disease as well. So you've just got to be careful that you're not doing more harm than good when you're feeding. So I guess, again, it just comes down to really thinking about what you're doing and being responsible in how you execute that.
Great, thank you. That's a great answer, and hopefully, yeah, that puts everybody across it a little bit more. I just wanted to, I was just thinking about what we spoke about earlier too, about actually people that maybe have quite a zone 5 on their property. And so zone 5 we're talking about as being our natural bushland, generally speaking, but we can also try and create a little bit of that, whether it's a wildlife corridor or preserving, if we do say have acreage, or just creating a little bit with putting native species in an area of our garden, you know, hoping to create the right environment and habitat and biodiversity to, you know, encourage those corridors, as you were saying. But talking about doing a bit of a count and a bit of a check-in with what we actually have got happening in our local area. And I think you mentioned an activity that you could do with your family to actually do a bit of a count.
Oh, that's right. Yes. So the iNaturalist app is absolutely fantastic, and it's citizen science. It was one of the first, I think, sort of national citizen science projects. It's actually a global database as well, but so you can photograph. You don't actually have to photograph. You can actually import records if you've just sighted some wildlife as. But obviously, it's best if you can actually take a photo to corroborate your identification, and then you can submit that easily online, and that record then is absorbed into the official database, and so it can actually be used then for anyone doing research. Will actually access that information as well, and use it to get a up-to-date picture of natural populations. So yeah, it's really fun as well. It's quite addictive. So you can it's got a scope across anything from invertebrates, plants, all taxa. You can input. Yeah,
that's
so
awesome.
so
that's I as in I.
Yes, as in the letter I.
As in the letter I, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that looks like Sandy's popped that up in the chat pod for us, but I just wanted to double check. I'm sure Sandy checked it before she put it up there, but just to be sure. So that's a great way to, you know, engage the whole family and really observing what's around. And you know, I guess a lot of it can be getting out at night as well as what we see during the daytime, because many of our creatures are nocturnal, right? So
that's right. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think that was, oh no, hang on a minute. Yvonne's just said, oh, I have so many noisy miners in my place that they chase away any other birds that may come by. Will planting native species really make a difference, or is there something additional that I could do?
Oh, that's tricky. I mean, technically, if you plant a nice dense undergrowth or sort of mid-story of very prickly species, then that will give refuge to your smaller birds. That's in theory. Often these things in theory aren't as you know, don't actually pull through when it comes to practice, but that certainly wouldn't hurt. It would certainly give them, the small birds, some refuge. It really would depend on the context and on the surrounding landscape, I think, as to your chances of success there. And it would just be trying not to provide any minor birds, things like the grevilleas that have a lot of nectar producing flowers, that they actually benefit some of those more aggressive honey eaters. So yeah.
Very good, thank you. Sandy's just questioning, apparently there's an iNaturalist Connect with Nature, and there's Seek by iNaturalist. Are they two different?
Sorry, what was it again? Seek by iNaturalist, and what was the first?
iNaturalist, and she's put in brackets connect with nature.
I should think they'd both lead you to the same resource.
Okay, all right, good.
Yeah, it's pretty popular. It's so yeah, you'd find your way in, I'm sure.
Fantastic. I also just wanted to mention that Sandy mentioned earlier, and I think she posted in the Permaculture Central Coast group, or it might have been actually on her own private Facebook page, I'm not sure, that she recently saw an echidna at North Gosford, where she lives. And I mentioned to you that I saw one here on the weekend at Holgate. So it's really exciting to see those species that you don't often see.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think they're out and about at the moment. That's
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So if you've got a wooden house, you know the termite patrol's out and about. That's great.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's that Marcos mentioning that you've had them all around your place too. Wow. Fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. So is there any other questions before we let Wendy go for the evening? I just want to go out spotlighting with you, really. Let's go. Grab a torch.
It is fun.
Yeah, fantastic. I remember one time we came home from holidays and we've got a fireplace, and we actually had some microbats in the house.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was pretty special. We had to get them out though. Oh, lovely. So it looks like there's no other questions, and yeah, we'll probably let you. I know you've got a busy week with work, but everybody's just saying, you know, how fantastic the presentation's been and how much they've enjoyed it. I might get you to go off screen share, so if anybody wants to say goodbye in person, they could pop up on the camera if they wanted to.
There we go.
Awesome. Thanks, Wendy. So you've changed. You were over there, now you're over there. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Maybe that is an activity for down the track once, if we're ever out of lockdown, and you'd be interested. I'm sure we could make it an activity that we'd happily pay to come and look at some wildlife with you, if that's something that we could maybe talk about. Haven't asked you that at all on camera, so that was putting you on the spot a bit. So have a think about it.
Yeah, no, that would be terrific. Yeah, that's what I'm working on at the moment, is finding all the good spots around the Watagans, especially. There's that's sort of getting it's interesting to get a feel for where different species like to hang. Yeah,
we're definitely blessed with a lot of natural bushland around us, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lovely comment.
Well, thank you again so much for coming on tonight. And
absolute pleasure. And I'm definitely continuing my permaculture journey. So I'm looking forward to learning from you guys.
Well, you're very welcome. As I mentioned today, we'd love you to join our Permaculture Central Coast group. And we promise not to ply you with too many questions. But we've also got a gift voucher to join the group, a free membership for the year, to thank you for joining us tonight and doing this talk. So
wonderful.
So much for your time putting it together. It's been really fantastic. So.
My absolute pleasure.
Lovely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Nice to virtually meet you all, and I'll see you soon then.
Yeah, terrific. Okay. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Wendy.
Fantastic. So I'll say good night, everybody. Hopefully the recording will just go off when I end the meeting.
Night,
maybe
Kerry.
I could just stop it. There we go.
Thanks, Kerry.